Good evening, everyone. Today we will talk about the war in the Pacific, and we will discuss how it is America fights its wars in the Pacific against the Japanese. So, our essential question that you can see here is going to be sacrificing dignity in the death march, Bataan Death March, in terms of what sacrifices do people make in war. And so, what we'll talk about here at the very beginning is going to be what happens immediately after America is attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor. And what I want you to understand here, as I pull this video up real quick, or this map up real quick for you, rather, is that in 1941 in December, the Japanese don't just attack Hawaii, they also attack our colonies across the Pacific here in the Philippines. They attack Wake Island, they attack Guam, which is down over here. So they attack a number of American colonies and territories all at once in the Pacific. So, with the realization that war has come not just to Pearl Harbor in America, but also to our colonial possessions like the Philippines, which are, as you can see, remarkably close to Japan, what is going to happen to those troops, those soldiers that are in the Philippines, that are in places like Wake Island? And what's going to happen is that the Japanese attack on the Philippines it's incredibly successful. And over the period of several days, America is going to retreat off of the Philippine Islands. And what I've got here on this map that I've blown up is an enlargement of the Philippine Islands. And what I want you to see in particular is this little peninsula right here. This is the last holdout, the last group of American soldiers that are on the Philippine Islands. All the other elements of the islands have been captured by the Japanese, but this, the Death March that we're going to be discussing, happens on that little tiny red peninsula right there. That is the Bataan Peninsula, and this is going to be called, therefore, the Bataan Death March. So, what happens in this death march that we see American soldiers losing their dignity, right? It can't be that bad. All I'll say here today, because we're going to talk more about this tomorrow, is that the death march involved 78,000 American troops who had to march some 65 miles to a prison camp, and that 10,000 of them died along the way, and it was only a couple days long, that march, I think 3 or 4 days. So 10,000 Americans are going to die in those 3 or 4 days. That has to give you some conception of just how terrible this action was. Put yourself then in America's shoes. Japan has attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. It has attacked the United States and the Philippines and Wake Island, all of our territories. You're going to either be stunned and unable to respond, or two, you're going to want to respond. And that's what FDR wants to do. He wants to respond. He wants to strike back at Japan by showing American might. He wants to say, you can hit us hard, we can hit you harder. I want to bomb Tokyo, Japan. He says, right there, Tokyo, Japan, I'm coming for you. But he can't do it in a conventional way because the Japanese have taken all of our territories and colonies across the Pacific, making it hard for us to launch bombers and bomb Tokyo and then get back to Hawaii. We don't have a plane that can fly that far. So they have to come up with a clever new way to find the tools, find the planes, find the resources needed to bomb Tokyo in response to their attacks in December of 1941. So what the Navy does is it takes an aircraft carrier, and you can actually see that aircraft carrier right here, and instead of having fighter planes on it, they outfit it with long-range bombers. And these bombers take off from the carrier, and they make a one-way trip to Japan. They bomb Tokyo, and then
they have enough fuel to try and get to friendly territory. And they have to choose where to go. Will they fly to the Soviet Union and crash land there? Will they fly to Chinese-held territory, our ally against Japan, and crash there? There's no coming back for these pilots and these crew members. They know before they take off that they will be sacrificing themselves in all likelihood and never get back. And many don't. Only a few do. And we'll talk more about that in class tomorrow. But that sacrifice is being willingly made by our president saying, we need to strike back. We need to make sure they know we're not going to just roll over. So the president is willing to sacrifice those men, that material, in order to strike back at Japan after taking the Philippines, after bombing Pearl Harbor, and starting this war and attacking us really by surprise. You know, that sacrifice that FDR makes is actually pretty strategically brilliant, because even though he did sacrifice material and men in that war to bomb Tokyo, what he also does in sacrificing those men, he also convinces the Japanese leaders that their emperor is at risk. Remember, the Japanese emperor is viewed as a god in Japan. If the Japanese Navy and Air Force don't do something about this, don't somehow keep American carriers from getting close to their island, they can potentially lose their god figure if their emperor dies in a bombing. So the sacrifice of men and material that FDR makes in the Doolittle raid by bombing Tokyo is going to convince those Japanese leaders to attack Midway Island, the island that is closest to Japan that we hold, the island that our aircraft carriers used as a base when they bombed Tokyo. Ideally, if the Japanese take Midway Island, our carriers will never be able to get close enough to Japan to bomb Tokyo again and threaten the emperor. So what we'll see here is that the Japanese, too, are willing to sacrifice men and material to protect their emperor by attacking Midway Island. That's how important they view this emperor. And I want you to realize that, remember that for tomorrow's class, that the emperor is the reason that the Japanese are willing to go out and to try and attack Midway Island. Because at the start of this, in the summer, or the spring, I should say, of 1942, the Japanese Empire is massive. Between December, January, February, the Japanese Empire spreads all throughout Southeast Asia. They spread into this region of colonies owned by France and by Britain, into colonies owned by the Dutch and the Portuguese, and of course colonies owned by America. They conquer all this territory. They're even going to conquer Australia. At least that's their hope, that's their plan. So when America sends its pilots over there in the Doolittle raid, those pilots are captured, sacrificed. Most don't make it out alive. Most are killed by the Japanese. The Japanese then respond by attacking Midway Island. They also want to try and make us weak one other way. And I've got a map here I'm going to blow up to kind of show you what I mean. All right, here we go. Assuming I can get my big old fingers on it and actually blow it up. There we go. All right. Now, what do we have on this map? This, right there, that's Hawaii. This, right here, there's your Philippines. And of course, here is Tokyo. And now the Japanese are going to attack us at Midway Island, which is right there, midway between the United States and Japan. That, they hope, will prevent us from bombing their emperor. The second thing they're going to do is attempt to cut off the path of supplies that we've been sending to Australia. If they can gain control of this area of sea right down here, they can stop our ability to bring supplies to Australia. And then eventually, they can conquer all of Australia as well. So what we'll see is a two-part plan. One, attack Midway Island, protect their emperor. Two, attack American naval forces in the Coral Sea so that they can capture Australia. That's the idea. Unknown to them, we had broken the Japanese secret code, so we knew that these attacks were happening in both places. Our Navy responds wonderfully, sends a fleet to the Coral Sea to stop the attack there, and a fleet to Midway to stop the attack there. The Battle of Coral Sea down south by Australia, that's a draw. The Battle of Midway, though, a huge victory for us. And it's the turning point in the war in the Pacific. From that point forward, Japan will be on the defensive. They will never be able to mount large-scale attacks on us again. We will be mounting large-scale attacks on them. So, where do we go first? And what a great question, right? This question of where to go first, because the Japanese Empire on this map, like I've shown you, is huge. They own so many islands. Where are we supposed to go? Where do you attack? Which one? All of them? You take all of them one at a time? You kill every Japanese army soldier on each of those islands? You make a landing at each one? You kill them all? Let someone else deal with it? You can't do that, right? It would take forever. If we went island to island to island, if we went to every single one, well, we got this one, now we got to go to the next one and kill them all there. It would take forever to end the war in the Pacific. So our military has to come up with some other way. How can we efficiently get from Pearl Harbor, which is our last area in the Pacific, the Midway Islands that we still control. How do we get from here all the way to freaking Japan with large enough amounts of men and materials to invade that island and get them to actually, give up? So they start thinking, they start brainstorming. There's got to be some route to victory. There's got to be a way. How do we get there? And then our admiral in the Pacific, a guy named Nimitz, has an idea, and he says, "Oh, I have an idea. Yes, I do. And the idea is brilliant. We will do something called island hopping. We will only go to the most important islands, yes, and we will ignore the other ones." That's a pretty good idea, says General MacArthur. I kind of dig that, man. So Nimitz says, I'm going to go right through the center of the Pacific, and you can see it over here, right above my head. These islands right here. These are the ones that we will begin to attack with Admiral Nimitz. He's going to start taking a look at Iwo Jima. He's going to start taking a look at Okinawa, Taiwan, Tarawa, places right here in the central of the Pacific. Really important places. The guy who got kicked out of the Philippines when we lost it, General MacArthur. Oh, and here's what I want you to, do for me for tomorrow's class. I just want you to write General MacArthur's name down on a piece of paper and just give it to me on the sly. Don't tell anybody else who doesn't watch the video. They don't deserve to know. Shh. Only you deserve to know. That's right. So write down General MacArthur on a piece of paper, just hand it to me. So MacArthur, the guy that was in the Philippines, he's going to take the southern route. MacArthur is going to say, you know what, Nimitz, while you go through the center of the Pacific, I'm going to do the same thing, only I'm going to hop down here to islands like Guadalcanal, Papua New Guinea, Philippines, and we'll meet each other right here at Okinawa. We'll meet up. And by then, the only place left that we'd have to defeat will be Japan. So that's the strategy that we're going to use. They call it island hopping. It's a really, it's a clever strategy, and it works, but all the important islands that we have to invade are something called atolls, and this is really important to understand. I'm going to put an atoll map up here so you can see what I'm talking about. This is the first island that we really invade in large numbers in the Japanese Empire that's important. It's called Tarawa, and it's an atoll. And here in red You can see the island that we actually invaded. This is the one where the Japanese actually were. And you can see the other parts of the Tarawa Atoll right there. And then you can actually see this light blue stuff. What's that light blue stuff? That's coral reef. That's low-lying land that is just beneath the surface of the water, only a couple of feet. Not very deep down at all. I mean, really, this thing right here, it's just the top of a volcano that's just not all the way above the water anymore. So this is just the tippy top of that volcano just underneath the surface of the water. It's very, very shallow. Why do I make that point? Why do I bring that up? Because the invasion at Tarawa is a disaster. It's an unneeded sacrifice that our country makes. 6,400 dead Marines in 3 days. Why? Why is it unneeded? Because we don't come up with a plan to get over those teeny tiny shallow reefs that I put up on that map. We don't have a way over them. I'm going to show you two different things here. On the right is a typical landing craft boat with troops coming out of it. This is the boat that you go right up onto the beach, right, and the doors come down, plop, and everyone runs out. Oh, you're going to get shot on the way out. Everyone's dead, yeah. That's the typical one. That works in Europe, where there aren't coral reefs. It ain't going to work in the Pacific, not at all. Not a single one of these landing craft boats get over the atolls. All of them get stuck, which means that they have to, our soldiers have to, jump out of these things into water that is waist high and wade, carrying 50 pounds of gear plus a weapon above their head that they can't get wet because they don't want it to, be ruined. And they have to wade through that water in all of their clothing. Takes a long time. And they have to wade hundreds of yards off the shore to the shore while the Japanese are shooting at them. It's kind of like being at the fair, at the carnival with those little balloons or the ducks games that can kind of go by. The ducks just go like, doo, 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 and you get the BB guns and you're like, you shoot the BBs. That's kind of what this is like. The only one that made it to shore was this one right here. And it's called an Amphtrack. Part boat, part tank. This is the only kind of one, this isn't the exact one, it's an example of one, that actually made it ashore, because when it hit those reefs, it was able to ride over them. So the U.S. Marines take this severe casualties they didn't have to take, an unneeded sacrifice, because those landing crafts couldn't reach shore. But we start to use the Amphtrack more and more and more. We learn, our casualties go down, and that over time, Americans, excuse me, hold on one second, wait just a second, something in my throat. Oh, yeah, coffee. So that by August of 1944, only 2 years later, 2.5 years later, we're closing in on Japanese home islands. We're right off the door of Japan. USA, USA. And that strength is going to show itself again and again as we approach the end of this war. And on this last slide, what I want to point out to you is that the closer we get to Japan, the harder Japanese troops are fighting. For example, when General MacArthur actually invades the Japanese bases in the Philippines, it's going to be a bloodbath. He makes his way from Guadalcanal in 1942 to New Guinea, all the way to the Philippines. He oversees the largest naval battle in history, still to this day, called the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where America is actually losing the battle, but for some strange reason, the Japanese commander orders a retreat. Either way, he wins, and what we'll see are the Japanese willing to sacrifice themselves and fight to the death. That Battle of Leyte Gulf is the first time we saw what we call the kamikaze pilot, a suicide pilot who does extreme damage by crashing into the boats or into his targets. You can see one here about to crash into a destroyer, another here about to crash into an American ship as well. This kind of self-sacrifice wasn't limited to just kamikaze pilots. Like I mentioned that when he finally gets to the Philippines in 1944, that it's a bloodbath. Out of 81,000 Japanese troops in the Philippines, 80,000 of them die. Only 1,000 surrender. And they end up taking with them 100,000 Filipino civilians. 80,000 Japanese are willing to die. And the records show men that are wounded, on crutches, men that are still bleeding, lost limbs, charging the American lines. They would rather be shot and killed than go home alive. That kind of willingness to die scares the bejesus out of Americans. Because if they're willing to have 80,000 casualties in a place like the Philippines, what would they be willing to do if we actually invaded Japan? The death toll of American soldiers, if we invade Japan, is estimated to be in the millions. I'm not making that up. Millions of Americans might die if we have to invade those Japanese islands, because they will fight to the death. The last Japanese soldier in the Philippines surrendered in the 1970s. The dude refused to surrender. 1945 came and went, and that dude said, "I'm not going. Nope, not quitting." He stole food, he lived in the jungle, he fought on, sabotaging things to the 1970s. So the devotion of the Japanese to this cause is incredible. We're going to have to come up with a way to beat this nation without having millions of Americans die. And we'll talk about that in an upcoming lesson and in more detail. For now, we're good to go. Don't forget tomorrow, MacArthur.